Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about Kung Fu forms and how to use them properly. So the arts that I can speak about are Cha Chuan, which is a kind of long fist martial art, and Bagwajong. And both of those arts you can find versions of on the internet all over the place that have also been hijacked by supposed lineage holders, especially by people that just do forms as a performance art, and even as simple health exercises. But none of those are the traditional martial art, and that's not what I teach, and that's not what I'm talking about. So we practice these arts in the traditional way as combat martial arts. And these arts, as many others, have been passed down, mostly contained in forms that are passed along from generation to generation. So, but the forms are not meant to just be practiced in a way that you learn the stances or the structures and the movements between the postures from beginning to end of the form, and then these days that's it. That's the end of the form. You can say you know it. But traditionally that's not the case. That is just the beginning. And that's kind of sad to see because a lot of the art is lost that way. So the first thing to understand is that it is important, first of all, to learn all the postures and the transition movements from one posture to another through the form from the beginning to the end. So that's an absolute requirement, and it's only the first part, but it's very important. You can't skimp over that. And but again, it's not, once you've done that and you're fairly proficient at doing all the postures and movements, that still doesn't mean that you've learned the form. It's just the beginning. So after you've learned that, the next thing you need to understand is what the movements mean, right? How they can be used in combat, and once you, it's a little tricky because there's not always just one meaning for one movement, because sometimes there is and there isn't. So one movement is an expression of a technique that has a proper use of power, but it has to be a little bit adaptable so that you can use it in similar situations that are just a little bit varied from each other. You will never have even the most cooperative person attack you the same way twice, even though they're trying to. So you can extrapolate from that you have to learn the movement and how it can be adapted to different, let's call them fighting environments. But you have to understand what the limits of those changes are, while still keeping the purpose and use of the movement. And in doing that, I just call that understanding the limits of motion in a technique. And then you have to couple that with the proper use of power, so also the limits of use of power in a technique. But it's just one technique at a time. So it's interesting because it's not exactly the same every time. It might be frustrating if you're expecting that the movement is exactly the same every time, but it's not. So this idea of becoming familiar with the limits of movement and power, proper use of power and movement in a technique, requires a lot of physical development. Actually physical and mental and character development in order to be able to actually use the movements effectively and with the kind of power that would make it effective. And in doing that, the proper use of your mind and will is an important aspect of developing power. So it all gets down to your character and your capacity to focus, and coupled with a well-developed body that can create the motions and muscular movements that are required to create power. There are no magic bullets. There are no chi balls that some internal style will allow you to to fight with effectively, unless you can mess with somebody's mind. But we don't want to count on that, right? So anyway, I'm digressing. I just want to kind of, this is sort of the range of study that you're at in this aspect of learning a form, when you're understanding power in movement and how to use it. So once you've grasped those things, and you have some power, you know the motions, and you have some control, then you want to start sparring. But I call this limited sparring, and people call it by different names: one-step sparring, two-step sparring, that sort of thing. And here what you do is you'll limit the number and range of techniques that you can use in any session. So, for example, your partner will be somewhat compliant as well. So maybe for an example, I would allow you at this stage to use 2 punches. I don't care, any 2 punches in the form done correctly, and you have to attack and succeed to attack your opponent's body, abdomen, basically. And then the opponent can use maybe anything to block. They can do any kind of block. And so it sounds pretty easy, but I can tell you that's one of the most difficult things, is to only be limited to maybe 2 techniques, even though you can use the ones you want at will, when the opponent knows that you're going to attack the body, and they can defend any way they want. So you have to start to get very creative at this stage, and you have to get very, very familiar with like the creation and use of momentum and movement with the techniques when you're in relation to another person. So there's timing involved here, and there's control of power, and there's I guess those are the 2 main things. But the big thing is that there's an aspect of creative mind that has to be developed here, right? And it's kind of real-time thinking. When you go home after sparring, you'll think about these things, and you'll have a creative mind. You'll think, oh, I could have done this or that, and next time you'll go and try it. But on the spot, there's also the need to be creative, like in the moment. And so that's another kind of skill that you're developing. Actually, this relates to the fight and flight response. So that's the amygdala in your brain. That's responsible for that. And so, you hear quite often that in a real fight, you can only do maybe 25% of the movements that you will do when you're not under stress. And so that's like, people often consider that the end of the story, but the rest of the story is that that's just a baseline. That's limited by the development of your amygdala in your brain, basically, and you can train that. So this type of sparring, which it's almost threatening, but it's not threatening, allows you to develop that part of your response, your brain, to, I don't know, I guess for lack of better words, remain calm under a wider variety of threats, and to have something to respond with. So you're kind of developing in that way. It's a creative thing as well. So that's the 3rd stage of learning a form. The 4th stage, maybe I could call it the last stage, is that you need to free spar with these movements in the forms. So in free sparring, we have some variations. Maybe in a sense you can use anything. Everything goes. But at least one person should be limited to using only the techniques that are in the form, any way they want, how they want, when they want, timed as they want, but it should be only the techniques in the form. And another person that they're sparring with could be allowed to do anything, takedowns, punches of any kind, kicks, whatever. But you should be able to understand how to use the movements in your form against everything. So that's a lot of fun, and that takes a lot of time to get familiar familiar enough to use the techniques that way. But there's something else. It's kind of the highlight of this aspect of sparring. And something I teach is that you need to start to take note of what your instincts are. Study your own instincts. And then when you go home, you think about it. Like, for example, somebody rushes towards you, your instinct was dodge to the side and try to take a step past them. It's a simple instinct, but it's quite common. I have that instinct. And then you look in your form, and I can guarantee, well, in our forms, I can guarantee that there will be sort of a refined version of exactly that instinct. Maybe almost the same two steps, but the body method will be refined. The response, the attack that comes out of it will be refined. The way that you can deal with that incoming power will be refined. But basically, it's that same instinct, again, just refined. So that's a really interesting part of learning forms, is to study your instincts, understand how they relate to the movements in the form, and then unite your instincts with the movements in the forms. So in a sense, at that point in time, your sparring is, in a way, it's instinct. It's not just remembering what to do, but you've aligned your instincts with refined movements to the point that your instinct is also those refined movements. So at that point, I think I would say you've learned the form. But at the same time, you have to say you still haven't learned the form, because that part of training goes on forever. There's no end to it. So, but it is sort of the higher level of learning form. I would let you say you've learned a form at that point. So you can see that's far, far from the beginning, where you just learn to do the movements from beginning to end. So, in addition to that, beyond learning the form, I encourage everyone who trains with me to seek out and spar with people from other styles too, because there's surprises. Sometimes you'll feel like you were dominant and maybe victorious in your sparring. It's not fighting, it's sparring. And sometimes you'll feel like you were completely dominated, and both of those are good things. So then you go home and you think, like, what could I have done? How was I dominated? What could I have done to change that, to overcome that? And that's taking your style to the highest level. At that point, it's sort of you're on your way to mastery. So I sort of caution people from, the first time you feel defeated, you go, oh, I got to learn that style. No, you'll always be a beginner. You'll never find mastery, and you'll have with the sort of grand uncles of most of our styles would say is like you'll end up as a horse with a donkey's tail and a dog's head, and maybe a snake's skin, and all of those things in and of themselves are good, but they don't fit together in one animal. So the same with your style. If you've chosen something wisely and it spoke to your heart, and you studied that style and you learned it, then you should master it and train it against other styles. But don't jump ship as soon as you feel like, oh, I wasn't victorious. So that's my point of view only. That's how I trained. That's what I've done in my lifetime, and still can't say I know it all, but that's what I recommend. So that's what it means to learn a form in traditional martial arts. And again, I'm so saddened, almost embarrassed to see that so many schools only teach the forms as something to learn from beginning to end. And once you've learned that sequence and you're half good at performing it, that you're considered that you know the form, and even worse, that you know the traditional style. Okay, well, I could really start rambling at this point, but I'm going to stop here. And I hope this can help anyone that's stuck in that rut of just learning forms and not really learning a martial art, to find ways to progress, and maybe even just on your own try to follow the sequences that I outlined. But you do need a teacher. That will save you like 40 years to have someone who knows that path. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have to say. Bye for now. Train well, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.